The topic is pattern splendor, textiles depicted on Javanese sculpture from the 8th to 15th centuries. I'm Paul Levy. I'm an associate professor of South and Southeast Asian art history here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And on behalf of our Center for Southeast Asian Studies, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Dr. Leslie Pullen. Leslie has an extraordinary amount of international experience. She's a self-professed late bloomer, which is a nice sort of reassurance to us all about decisions we can make anytime in life in terms of our interests. But she has extensive international experience. Born in northern Sumatra, educated in Hong Kong and the UK. She met her husband in KL, Kuala Lumpur, spent 25 years living around Asia, and then attended SOAS University in London, focusing on her interests in South and Southeast Asian art history and material culture. She finished her PhD there in 2017. She also taught there for a number of years in the SOAS postgraduate diploma program. Subsequent to receiving her PhD in 2017, she was appointed as a postdoctoral research associate at SOAS. And she has similarly been doing research and teaching at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London since 2015. And of course, they're famous for their textile collection, right? So we're very excited to hear Leslie's very rich perspective on international interactions involving Southeast Asia, particularly, of course, Java from the 8th to the 15th centuries. Before I turn it over to her, I would just like to say that we're inviting questions to be submitted through the Q&A tool on your Zoom. And those will be collected and curated. And after Leslie speaks for about 40 minutes, then I will present questions to Leslie in a conversational format. So please join me in welcoming Leslie Pullen.
Thank you, Paul, very much for a really wonderful introduction. You've put me on the spot and I hope I fit the bill. So let's get going. But I'd especially like to thank Barbara and Dia for inviting me, and to Miriam and Sarah and to you, Paul, for agreeing to moderate this talk. So this book, Pattern Splendor, is the first time that a book has been published which covers a selected choice of sculptures from Central and East Java, which are not part of an exhibition, museum, or private collection. These sculptures were chosen because of the unique design of the textile patterns, an aspect of Javanese study which has been attempted before, but which leaves this book as a fundamental piece of work in the field of Javanese art history for students, teachers, and future scholars alike. It clearly highlights how the economics of the time were focused on the transference of goods in and around Java and Sumatra, both islands which were central to the international trade at the time during this long period of Javanese history. But I would especially like to dedicate this lecture in honor of Jan Weissman Christie, who died earlier this year, and her work on text and textiles, which she wrote in the 1990s, was really instrumental in so many aspects of my early research. So the textiles which do remain only reflect a tiny slice of history, no more than 200 to 300 years at the most. However, the stone and bronze statues appear as a template in many instances for the production of contemporary textiles. And this is really what this book is about, is what we saw in this long period of history from 8th to 15th century as many templates from the textiles that we see today. In the 1980s, there was an important conference at the Textile Museum in Washington. The proceedings were edited by Matabel Gettinger, who produced some of the most important research to date on the history of Indonesian textiles. My book, which came out early this year in 2021, follows on from much of this research and answers many of the questions that were posed at the conference. So in 40 minutes, of course, I cannot cover everything I covered in my book, but as you can see from some of the headlines here, but I will focus quite a little bit more on Central Javanese statues, as many of them have not been published before. And it's a subject I think many people are quite interested in and is little known. Maps are always very important in any book. And I decided very early on that I needed to produce my own maps for this book. So during lockdown last year, during the summer, March to September, I worked with a cartographer in Oxford I never saw him, he never saw me. The whole thing was done by email, and we produced 5 maps. And you will see all of them here. And I think the maps were hugely significant, helped to bring together the text of the books. On this one, of course, there was many decisions as to what to put on it, but I think the captions on the left show you enough as to the sort of idea that I felt that was important. But really what it does highlight, of course, is that Sumatra and Java were instrumental in the trade routes between China, the Indian subcontinent, and the Persian world further to the west. And that Srivijaya, or Palembang today, and the north coast of Java were key jumping off points for trade routes. Hence that so much of the material that we find that are reflected on the sculptures that we're going to look at actually came through these 2 regions. So on the left here, we have a list of all the maps that you'll be seeing. But what I want to show you on the right, so this lecture was really going to look at the complexities of researching and analyzing such a variety of sculptures using empirical methodology, and detailed line drawings of the textile patterns. This is the kind of thing that I produced in the book, and I'm going to explain to you how we reached them. So we have an image of Durga here that comes from Chandi Singasari from the Singasari period, dated till about 1292. So the 2 periods of Java that we're going to look at, the Central and the East Java. So with the dates are on the slide. So I wanted to explain to you how this whole project got started. I was visiting the Volkenkund Leiden Museum in Leiden, the Ethnographic Museum, when I was a postgraduate art history student at SOAS in 1998. I had just arrived from India. I had little art history background, but I was incredibly keen. And I came across these sculptures, as in the slide in the bottom left here. That's a picture of me, and you can get an idea of the size. These are large sculptures. I had a background in textiles, but when I saw these sculptures, I thought there's something going on here that nobody's ever written about. What were all these textile patterns that we saw on these sculptures? So after I completed a master's degree in Balinese textiles, I decided on a PhD to work on textiles, but there was no obvious subject. So I thought I'll work on these sculptures. But to just do East Java was not enough. So I then incorporated the idea of working on Central Java sculptures at the same time. And so what you see on the left side, on the top 3 slides are from Central Java, from a silver, a gold, and a stone statue. So a combination of all of these was fine. We looked at the statues, but how was I going to identify them, and how was I going to create the designs? So these drawings you see, these 2 drawings here, appear at the end of each chapter, and we'll look at them a little more further and explain to you what these mean. So that is the book on the left, Pattern Splendour, with the image of Manjushri on the front, which overlays the textile pattern on the Manjushri. So on the right, you're seeing 2 statues, a tiny little bronze, which is actually only 10 centimeters, and a 4.14 high image of Mahakala. Now, if I made the bronze in proportion, he would only come up to the plinth, but if it would be so small, you wouldn't even see it. So the point of this slide is that size matters. This whole problem of the work that I did was I was dealing with very small bronzes and huge sculptures, many of which I couldn't see in person. The bronzes were, some of them were in museum collections. You couldn't take them out of the glass case, you couldn't handle them, or I only found images in books that I couldn't do anything with them. How were you going to tell one from the other? How were you going to create the actual patterns? Just by looking at them was not enough. I had to have some other form of creating this whole idea. And then, of course, there's distinct 2 textile, the 2 historical periods, as we saw on the previous slide, from this one and the Central Java at the sort of 8th, 9th century. So, and then there's a huge jump of about 300 or 400 years until we reach East Java in the sort of 14th, 15th century. And there was a complete difference in style and design. So how are we going to get there? The most important thing that happened was I decided to employ a draftsperson. So I had been working on this project for about 2 years. And I realized I wasn't getting anywhere because I couldn't portray these sculptures properly without being able to see the designs. So I advertised in the Royal College of Art, which was very close to where I lived in London, in Kensington. 4 people replied, and the person I employed was a young lady called Yiran Huang. She's Chinese from southern China, and she was on her second MA on design. And the brief that I gave everybody, and she was the only one that replied to it correctly. So the examples you can see here on the right was a central Javanese statue. And you can see from the size, this is only 10 centimeters. It's big enough to just sit in your hand, quite damaged. It's a super little piece, and it was in the Leiden store. And I asked all the people who applied for my job was to create the bottom half of the statue. Just show me the lower limbs with the textile on the cloth. And then on the East Javanese, I sent them 2 or 3 pictures, and I wanted them to take the textile off the statue and create a piece of cloth as an example, showing the borders of the patterns. Now this image of Mahakala is quite large, and you can see in the proportion that I put here, the Trailoka Vijaya, you can see how small it is. So this is a huge problem as to how were we going to create these designs so that they all looked uniform and that there was some kind of proportion in size. And Yiran just did the job. I never told her exactly how to do this. She just did it. She was absolutely brilliant. And we worked together closely for over 2 years. She came to my apartment and we looked at photographs on the computer, and she went off home and did the drawings, and we came back, and then I started to catalog them. So the next problem is how to catalog these. Obviously the natural was to go from Central Java and East Java, that's fine. But in Central Java, the period is very small. You're really dealing between the 8th and 9th century only. So you've got 100 years and many hundreds of statues. Now, I only chose a handful because if I chose every statue that I saw, my book would be huge, too expensive, and I'd still be at it today. So I decided to choose just a cross section of the sort of patterns that appeared most extensively. And this is the first grouping of patterns. So I put the sculptures together in pattern groups. It didn't matter whether they were a male or a female statue, or they were Hindu or Buddhist. So the simplest of all the design is this one, the flower petals in bands. So we have 2 statues here. On the left is a pair of Shiva Parvati in gold, and on the right is a bronze Manjushri. So what I want you to look at is we have statues in this early period that do have an Indian influence within the designs of the sculpture itself, somewhat in the textile pattern, and also in the design of the actual cloth that they're wearing. And this changes dramatically once we get to the East Javanese period. So you keep your Indian hat on at the moment by looking at the design of the sculpture, but also the dress style. What we have interesting here on this female, this dress style is actually nothing to do with any design you ever see in India. It's this completely Javanese type of dress. I propose that they're wearing some form of a dodot, and I'm sure some of you know what that is. It's a long hip wrapper that's worn over another cloth, and this is all the form of the textile bunching up around the waist. Now, the design here of these Indo-Egyptian cottons that were published by Ruth Barnes in the Newbury collection in Ashmolean represent a lot of the cottons that I think we see on these early Indian bronzes, these early, Javanese sculptures, these simple designs. And we look at the next slide. We're now looking at 2 stone Ganesha. So this looks like a bronze, but it's actually a volcanic stone. And you have the same very simple floral design. So there's another example on the left of these rosette patterns in Indian trade cotton as well, which could be the sample that were used. What I'd like to add at this stage, as I've been asked many times, surely these are not textiles. Surely the craftsmen just made pretty patterns. I think that's absolutely wrong. The craftsmen were creating textiles, but what they weren't doing was using their imagination and just making anything, because otherwise the designs wouldn't be so specific, so uniform, in many cases so perfect as they are. So I think it's highly likely that what was happening is there was a trade of textiles and the ideas morphed, and the craftsmen were commissioned. Remember, of course, no craftsman makes something of his own volition. He's commissioned by a patron, and the patron would suggest what was to be made on the sculpture. So there's a third section of, again, stone statues with a very simple design. The outside two remain in situ out in the field, and the one in the middle is in the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. In fact, that Garuda is the most interesting statue. There is only one Garuda in anywhere that I've seen in Java, and this is quite an extraordinary piece. But what's interesting is the detail here I point out to you is the sashes around the waist. This is, and the one here drawing from this Augustia. This is a very, very distinctive Javanese feature. It becomes even more elaborate when you move to East Java. But at this stage, the craftsmen absolutely knew what they were doing. They were recreating exactly what was worn by local people at the time. There was a particularly popular Augustia cult going on right through to East Java. There are many statues of Augustia, and he was a very popular statue. So then the next pattern was circles and dots. Now, the textiles on the left, you can see really described as bandani or tie-dye. Pelangi and tritic is another terminology that we use in Java, and those sort of textiles are made in Bali in great quantities. But there are many, many statues with these simple circles, or simple circles with horizontal bands, as we see here. But I'd like you look at these two sculptures. The one on the right, the Manjushri, is very possibly a local copy of a sculpture that came in from Bangladesh or Orissa in Eastern India. And there's this huge trade that we're going to look at in the moment. And so there were sculptures that were found in Java that were actually made as replicas of Indian pieces, but just had that tinge to them that made them much more Javanese than actual Indian in design. And one of those aspects is the textile pattern itself, and just the fact that it's carved with a design. There are very few Indian bronzes that actually have a textile pattern on them, certainly not with the variety that we see in Java. So the concept of textiles and cloth being synonymous with the Javanese is very strong. And that's quite evident when you look through the different patterns that we come across. Then there's a group called horizontal bands, and these were loads of them, many of them, and I'm just showing you three here because they're very sophisticated. Now, if you look at the sizing of the sculptures here, to remind myself, some as much as 37 centimeters, but can go down to about 12 centimeters. That's very small. So you think of the craftsman who's had to carve these very tiny designs. So what I put here is an example from Warpeacat in Ende Market. Now, Jan Christie in her work talks about the colors of red and blue being available, the dyes in the markets way back at least to early of the 10th century. She also talks about Warpeacat and the types of looms and the types of weavers that were prevalent at that time. So we know that Java was making these types of textiles. We know that that was possible. And I propose that that's what we're seeing on these sculptures here was a form of Warpeacat. But there is also another proposal. This piece here on this royal figure, I think it's not. What we're seeing here is a sonket. Now, a sonket is a brocade. It's also, it's supplementary weft gold bound threads. Now, again, the texts tell us that the Javanese were making a brocade. The Chinese were also making a brocade, and these were transferred backwards and forwards and traded. Now, Java gave up once the Islamic period happened. There is no songket being made in Java. So, but it was happening because we know from the type of the weaver that was in the markets at that time. And this is all written up in the SEMA charters that Wiseman Christie did so much work on. Now, this statue, the Bora Ganesha, has been published many times. But the person who's written about it the most was John Guy when he launched his famous book, Woven Cargoes, which I was fortunate enough to launch for him when he was working at the V&A. He and I have stayed good friends ever since, and I know I've disputed some things he said about this textile. So this Bora Ganesha was carved in the beginning of the Singasari period, which starts at 1222. So the statue is dated 1239 to 1240, as you can see from up here, which is from the inscription. So he's a bit of an anomaly because he doesn't fit into anything. So we've now left the Central Javanese period behind, and this early period of the East Javanese, the Singasari period, there are very few statues. After we left the Kadiri period at the beginning of East Javanese time, there were lots of Ganesha and many Durga, but almost all of them were much smaller than this one, and almost without any hesitation, there were no textile patterns at all. The Indian archaeologist Eddie Sediwati wrote a fantastic book on Ganesha from the Kadiri period, and it did include this one, but she never was able to do any research into the textiles itself. So this is the first time I'm going to introduce to you the word kawung, and that's a design here that we see these interlocking circles on the base of this sculpture. So the kawung has been written about again in this conference that I talked about earlier, the 1980 conference. There was much discussion as the origin of the word kawung and this type of interconnecting circles. So it's believed that this really was indigenous in Java or indigenous to Java, even though I would have to say this type of patterning has been known way back to the Harappan period in BC in Western India, but that had nothing to do with what's going on in Java. So this is reflecting the ancient Javanese concept of manchapat, which is a compass card structure of 4-5, the structure of 4 and 5, the 4 outer points and 1 in the center. So this is really a pre-Hindu concept and comes from the Austroasiatic language speakers, i.e. From the Austronesians. So the very important concept of the 4 and the 1 in the middle, but you can also break it down into 9 by taking the 4 outer points and taking the compass card and the north, south, southwest, etc., and 1 in the middle. So we have 4 plus 4 plus 1 makes 9. Now 9, of course, is used in the Patola motif of Chabadi Bat, which or called Jelamprang in Java. So this type of numbers setup was very important to the Javanese, and it's something that appears as we go through the East Javanese period. The kawung design, or part of what's known as the Cheplok pattern group, appears many times in different variations. So let's take us back to India briefly. We had many pilgrims, the monks from China and Southeast Asia, visited these sacred sites of Buddhism. They were the last stronghold of Buddhism in India, such as the monastery and University of Nalanda and Vikramshila in Bihar. And it was during most of the Hindu-Buddhist period, however, the more significant influence was generally felt from Northeast India as really the main starting point of Indian artistic inspiration. However, Indonesia derived its ideas from Indian contacts from other areas, also from Western India, from the cotton textiles I showed you, but also from South India for a long period, way before the Chola period of the 10th, 11th century. But I think it's from Northeast India that has seemed to have the greatest influence on what we see especially in Central Java, and then a resurgence in East Java with one particular sculpture we'll look at in a moment. Now, here is one of the first maps of the book on Central Java. And what I've done is showed you where all the sculptures originated, with the name of the Chandi and the sculpture underneath it as to where they're actually originated from, may not necessarily in situ at the moment. And you can see quite clearly that they cluster very much around Chandi Pramban, Plausan and Chandi Sewu, and then of course around Borobudur, with a few scattered around the other regions. But to understand the sculptures, I think we need to understand the Chandi's areas that they came from or that they were associated to. So I'm sure for many of you listening know about Javanese history, and that we have the two most famous sites is Borobudur and Prambanan, one Buddhist and one Shaivite. And of course, between the 7th and 8th century, there was a huge movement of pilgrims and monks and traders into this region. And hundreds of sculptures and stone statues were made, many of them used for dedication to the monasteries or for protection for the travelers themselves. And then as the time moved on, we come to the Singasari period, and there's this gap of 300 or 400 years between where not much was made. There were things happening. It didn't just stop in one period and start in the other, but we don't have time to go into what happened in between. There probably was volcanic eruption, but I think there was disturbance in the religious parameters as what's going on. And by the Singasari period, was very Shaivite. But we also have a great tantric ideas coming together at this stage, especially with the last king Kritanagara, who reigned from 58 to 1292. And he followed Buddhism and Hinduism together, and we get this mixture and have a lot of tantric iconography that came through. So there were 4 Chandis in this period. I show you 2 here. One is Buddhist, the top one, Chandi Jago, and the bottom one is the Shaivite Chandi. And that right at the end, we have the Majapahit period. And here we see the kingdoms mostly become Shaivite at this stage. There was still sort of tantric energy happening, but there was a great amount of peace, a lot of wealth, many statues at this stage, very few of them with textile patterns. Most of them were plain, but they're very stylized and rather stiff. So the style had changed completely. I want to look briefly at Sumatra because I actually bring in 4 sculptures from Sumatra and that little one in Borneo, which we won't discuss in this lecture. So we'll be looking at 3 of them from Sumatra, but not from the Padang Lawas. Sumatra, as you can see, indifferent to Java, is a huge island, and very different cultures were going on during this period. But I think we need to look briefly at the Chandi in Sumatra. Chandigongkong is part of Muara Jambi, which became the new center, a new mandala in about 11th century. And the one sculpture that we're interested in is the Prajnaparamita. Now, sadly, she has no head and no elbows. Her hands are still in situ, but we'll look at her again in a moment. Then the Padang Lawas is very much a tantric Buddhic site, and we see whole reliefs, carving reliefs of these dancing figures, and I won't go into those in this lecture. Then in Candi Bumi Ayu, we will look at this statue, the small archer figure. And then, of course, there's the most famous Padang Roko and the book image of Mahakala, and this is how he was found on the ground. But what's interesting is all the Chandi here are made of brick. The sculptures are either made, as this one from tuff, which is a very soft white volcanic stone. She was carved in a beautiful, very smooth, pale volcanic stone. And he, of course, in a completely different stone. So when you look at East Java, what you see is rice and Chandis and mountains. Now, the scholar Hadi Sidamulyo has spent many years studying the architecture of East Javanese temples and Mount Penugonan, which is up here. And in his recent book on old Javanese texts, which in fact came out exactly the same time as mine, he describes Penugonan as 5 peaks associated with Mahameru from India, whose unique form displays 5 summits, and that's what you see on the top here. And it's really, again, it's the concept of 4 and 9 and the 9 peaks of Penugonan. So it's the same concept of the numbers of the 4 plus 4 plus 1. And this really carries through Javanese art all the way through, especially in East Java. An aspect of the sculptures that's been of great interest to me is the lost textile patterns. And I wrote a small article for a Dutch journal a couple of years ago about 5 sculptures of sculptures with the designs have almost completely disappeared. So what we have on the right here is the lower limbs of a dikpala, or a guardian of the directions. And the upper one here comes from the book from J.L.L. Brandes, who wrote it in 1909, his most famous book on Chandi Singasari and Chandi Jago, the huge volume. I mean, they're this big, with the most wonderful plates. So when I visited the Chandi, this sculpture over 120 years later, if you'll notice here that the textile pattern, and I'm going to give you a close-up, is actually quite visible. You can see the drawing, but if we move down 100 years later, the design is almost completely disappeared under the black lichen on the statue. And here is the drawing of the pattern. Now, what we've done, and Yuran was able to look at the original sculpture from Brandis's book and from my own photographs and create her textile design. And as we go through the East Javanese sculptures themselves, you can see how clever she was in literally lifting that design off the legs of the sculpture and placing them as a piece of cloth. Excuse me. Now, the one on the left here is, I refer to it as an unidentified goddess because we don't know who she was. She definitely is sacred because she had 4 arms. The arms up here are missing, but we can see where they would have been, with her hands held together in the middle holding a censer. But if I close up again, I'd like to show you slightly closer up. You can clearly see the textile design here. There's enough circles here that Yuran, with her skill, was able to create the design. So I feel my book has been able to lift these patterns off these sculptures, which remain in situ at Chandi Singasari, and bring them to you, students, teachers and scholars alike. And when these sculptures are long since gone, you'll remember what was being made and worn and used in Java in the 13th century. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit here at the moment by looking at the text and see how we see things interpreted on the sculptures themselves. So we're going backwards a little bit into the Central Javanese statues, and this grouping, this pair of Shiva and Parvati, they're both in gold. You can see the size is 21 and 24 centimeters. So they're not that small, they're a decent size. So big enough to make a reasonable pattern. But the design on both of them is completely different. It's as though they're not made by the same person at all at the same time. The physiognomy of the body is similar, but the depiction of the textile is completely different. This is very much in the Indian style because the man is wearing a dhoti, which means the cloth is pulled up between the legs, tied at the back of the body and tied off with a sash, which Yuran has created in this superb drawing. Whereas the Parvati is wearing what I refer to as the tapis or a kain, a long cloth that is obviously solid to the mid-calf length, which has nothing to do with any form of Indian design because no Indian sculptors are ever dressed in this way. The only South Asian influence we see on this is her sacred chain here, which is referred to as the Chanavira, which is not a Javanese inspired event. That is very much an Indian item, as is the Upavita on this sculpture. Now her textile here is quite interesting, and it's something I'd like to discuss later, hopefully, if we get to the end of this, the lecture, because there is all sorts of stories behind this type of pattern. So we'll look at that a little later on. Now, this is the pressure parameter from Mara Jambi. When I visited here, I was involved in a conference in Jambi, and she remains in a small site museum. It's extremely hot, very full of mozzies, and she's pushed right up against the wall with a spotlight shining on her that the very kind guards would not turn off. So actually trying to photograph her was really difficult. So my husband had a real trial. So to get a decent picture of this sculpture is quite hard. But what we did do was to take the close-up of the legs and the design. So what you can see here is the circle of the textile pattern, but it's this border that I'm going to focus on. And you'll notice it here in the drawing. So when you go back to Middle Javanese literature of the 13th to the 15th century, there are 4 works that talk a lot about garments worn by the elite. And there's a phrase that comes up quite often that says, Abasuk lima sisinon, and that really means a waistcloth of pale green silk. So what I'm showing you here, this happens to be green, is actually a limar. So the word limar is used today in to describe a weft ikat. So we have a small amount of gold across the top, but this is all ikat in the weft threads. And what I propose is the design across the border here and the designs that you see on these 2 textiles reflects what we see on the bottom here. And this is the first example that we have, the earliest example. And I think the statue is probably dated to about 1250, 1260. Of a form of a weft ikat with a tumpled border done in this simple design. Now, this type of patterning is also apparent on Khmer textiles, and there was a lot of trade between Cambodia, the Khmer, and down with the Javanese and to Sumatra through Srivijaya in gifting as well as trading of textiles. So my suggestion is this is the earliest evidence of this type of border pattern that we actually see. Now this sculpture is actually called a Harihara Ordinary, and it's supposed to represent the young King Krotanagara, the last monarch of the Singasari period. He's very interesting. He remains in St. Petersburg in Russia, in the museum, in the Hermitage. And he and the next sculpture we're going to look at were on display only for 3 months. He has never been seen before. This is the first time he's been published, except for in a small museum article in German with a very tiny little picture in about 1900. So I'm excited to be able to show this to you because it's something that nobody's ever seen before. But why I'm using him here is an example of what was written in, again, this Middle Javanese literature. So it's the concept of the king who wears a choice sinjang, which is the word for a long cloth, decorated with gold, with tumple patterns, which is what you see in the bottom here. And this is the sort of textile he's wearing. And Yiranyets did this drawing of the whole half of the body of her own volition. I didn't ask her to, but I think she got so fascinated with what was going on. And he wears a double cloth and possibly decorated with gold, very likely that would have happened because he was a king. And it's the first time we notice this banji design on the border pattern. It's the beginning of strong Chinese influence that was going on, that came in onto the north coast of Java. This is on a Lokchan textile of mine that's made by the Chinese in Chinese silk that was traded to Sumatra and to Bali. So in this next slide, I'm looking at the examples of how do we research sculpture. After I started work, I met an anthropologist and a Javanese scholar in Malang in East Java, and he told me that you really must always look at the sculptures first, which is what we have here. Then you should read the text, which is what I try to do with Wiseman Christie's work and many others. And then you look at the ethnography, at the material that's reflected in the sculptures. So the texts talk about Xinjiang, which is a long cloth. They talk about a wastra and a kampu. They also talk about grinsing, which is what you hear. This is a grinsing, a double ikat. So we know that the kings wore something called grinsing kawun, or a Xinjiang grinsing. So this sculpture is wearing a textile with the same design as we see here. It's a form of this interlocking circles. And what you're noticing on the top here, this guardian sculpture of Nandishvara has a short upper body jacket, exactly the same as we see on these Javanese performers. And on the right is, he's wearing a waist sash, which is an Indian trade patola made specifically for trade to Java in this particular design. So you're looking out of the box, you have to look elsewhere, radiate out from the sculptures and work out what the influences were, or were they templates for something that we're seeing today. And then the Manjushri that appears on the front of the book has the most extraordinary textile design with these incredible interlocking circles. So where did this inspiration for these come from? So I'll take you to the next slide. And we look at the pattern drawing on the left. Is probably the most complex design that Iran had to draw. And I look at relief carvings in Central and East Java on the top 3 slides here to show this type of effervescent flowing lotus lily leaves that scroll and come out of the boxes of the circles that we noticed here. But it's also apparent on Pagan, on relief architecture in Pagan of the same about 12th century period. So we have a lot of mythical animals within the circles here, which reflect back to Sasanian art. That's something else I could talk about later, but there's not enough time to go into it too much at the moment. Now, Brandes in his book of 1909 features all this East Javanese sculpture. So I'm showing you these statues, which they thought of as being Tara or possibly Lakshmi. Now today, this is what the sculpture looks like when I took the photograph in 2016. The head here is not the original. Unfortunately, early explorers actually found a head and stuck it on top of this statue, but it is not the original. In fact, it spoils it. I sometimes feel I should cover it so you don't see the head. But what we do, what I'm interested in, is if you look at this design, is that the extraordinary detail you can see. I'll give you a close-up here. You can see how the textile pattern is quite clear down this front section, but on the stone here, that's completely exfoliated. So if we go to the next picture, down the left-hand side of the body, through the circles, you'll notice that there are actually animal roundels within these designs. So juxtaposing circles, as you'll notice at the drawing on the left, of a duck. Now, a duck is very popular in the Sasanian Empire and appears in many, many textiles, as we notice from the top of the drawings here, but it's also possible in Jain manuscript paintings too. So I think this really highlights that there was a huge trade through the Silk Road, through the Sasanian and the Sogdian period, right from India through to Yuan period in China, and traded down into East Java. So a few more examples of different forms of ducks, from Ajanta to Takibustan, Sasanian rock paintings, and to Indian cottons, all with this similar motif. So this is just very popular for a long period of time, and obviously ended up in Java only, and this one sculpture only. So this is the image from Chandigongkong that I show you from South Central Sumatra. So it's an archer, the word for sculpture, and leluhur means it's an ancestor figure. So what's interesting about this figure is that it's sitting in wearing a jacket with long sleeves and a baju, and a kain to the ankles. but it's the patterning here that I'm very interested in. And I see a strong reflection in this Sasanian, can't get the word out, this Persian goblet here with the details of a ewer with floral lozenges and the cloud design. And this jar is in the Tang exhibition at the ACM. So we look at Persian jackets of the similar idea. And we know from the text that the word badzu, which is the Persian word for this type of jacket, was adopted into Malay language. And the word today is kabaya or abaya or a baju. So I think there's a strong correlation between the Persian influence in this central area in Sumatra that came in from Baras on northwest Sumatra, where there was a huge amount of trade from one of the early main trading ports. So the very last sculpture we will look at these two, and this is the only time I'll show you any evidence of tantric iconography. Both these two statues are 2 islands apart, one in Sumatra and one in Java, one of Mahakala and one Ganesha, and they both have a hip cloth here, and I will highlight this. If you focus your eyes, you see within the drawings here, these are both skull patterns, and the same very similar design, and within these triangles here, this is what we're seeing are these 2 skull designs. Now this patterning is called Chandra Kapala on the Xinjiang, and it really represents the fangs curl up the either side of the skull that represents the crescent moon. So these are the images of Shiva created in this very unique patterning that appears really only on these particular sculptures. So the last map shows you where all the East Javanese sculptures and the Chandis are situated, very much in the Malang region, surrounded by the Brantas River. And this became the heartland of the East Javanese period, Singasari right through to the Majapahit. Very wealthy, very lush volcanic soil, and a lot of trade was going on in this region. So at the end of each chapter, I created these comparative chart of line drawings. So these are all from Central Java. These are a couple of examples. And then in the East Java, what you see, of course, is the actual textile itself and not the sculpture. And I think it gives the reader and hopefully the students certainly a real idea of what was going on in Java at the time and how things changed so dramatically between the Central and the East Javanese period. And right at the end of the book, in the epilogue, I created a map that showed the diaspora of the sculptures, where they exist today. So the book addressed 73 stone and metal sculptures originating from Java and Sumatra. So of those 73, 51 remain in Java and Sumatra today, as you'll see from the numbers here, and the rest remain elsewhere. So I think it's an interesting comparison as to, where the sculptures have actually moved to. So to conclude, in the last 120 years, we have 2 world wars and many local political struggles for independence. And during this period, the amount of scholarship which has been completed, especially on East Java, has been very small. Important work, but very few compared to the previous century. Of course, these past works from the 19th century are either out of print, not available, or mostly in Old Dutch and German, and not accessible to the average student. So I'm hoping that my book has been able to draw on these past scholars, especially on J.L.L. Brandes, and show that the ancient Indonesians on both Sumatra and Java had a rich textile tradition dating back way longer than we had previously thought. Pattern Splendour has been able to bring to the reader something fresh and new, which has not been written about before in Javanese art history. So that's me done. Thank you very much. Sorry, I think I'm a bit too long, but I'm finished.
Thank you, Leslie. It was wonderful. Thank you for the visually very gorgeous presentation. And I will speak to the book and recommend everyone. She covered an immense amount of territory here, but in fact, if you want a deeper dive into all of this, the book is well worth your attention. So we have a lot of questions here, but not a ton of time. So in the interest of time and efficiency, I'm going to synthesize what I see as some of the directions of the questions. So they seem to be falling loosely into several categories. First, I'll lay them out, and then I'll turn them over to Leslie. The first sort of category of questions is people are very interested in how these sculptures provide evidence for textile production before we have surviving examples of textiles in Indonesia. And they're particularly interested in what you might be able to say about what you might be able to determine about techniques that are employed. You've talked about this a little, particularly tenun and batik, and when they might have originated, or if there's a chronological relationship that you can discern there. And songket is also thrown into that. So we'll start with that. In terms of technique and fabric type, textile type.
Okay, I think I will go back to Jan Christie. It really, because of her work she did on the SEMA tax transfer charters, by translating within the text, that we know that there were weavers of a certain type in Java during this period, especially 10th, 12th century. And it's because of what she did. And then she knew she was referring to the sculptures, but she never had the sculptures there. So it's a combination of her work and my work, putting the two together, that we know that there was a weaver of a certain type of textile at the time. And by looking and by knowing about textiles and studying textiles and then looking at the sculptures, we can put the two together. And that, excuse me, that we must have been looking at some form of ikat. Batik, no, at this stage. Batik, I know when I lecture in Singapore, everybody wants to know the origins of batik. It seems to be the enduring question. And I've done a lot of research recently, and batik, as you know it today, really didn't come into knowing until the Islamic period, so about 15th, 16th century. But there was drawing with color in early period. And again, in Christie's work, we know about something called tulis warna, which means drawing with color. We know about tulis mas, drawing with gold. We know that there was brocade and woven textiles. So you have to understand textiles today. You have to look at the text, as I was saying from my wonderful Javanese scholar who told me, and then you have to look at the sculptures. And if you bring all those together, you can then make your interpretation as to what are you looking at on the sculptures.
So do you feel like there's a clear chronological relationship between earlier woven cottons, mordant dyed, block printed, versus the emergence of metallic threaded woven songket type textiles?
Yes, I mean, the gold textiles were definitely known. I think by 8th century, probably not. From Christie's work, I think, 10th, 11th century, we know because they were trading it during the Song period. The Song in China were very businesslike and did a lot of trade. They had brocaded textiles. We know that the gold thread was being made possibly in Sumatra, because there's not enough gold in Java, but Sumatra was the land of gold, as everybody knows, and the Indians went to Sumatra for gold. And also by looking at the designs, if you look at the designs, you know that you're dealing with a woven textile. The scholar Mary Louise Totten has just, she talks about this in one of her articles about that we're looking at brocaded textiles on these sculptures, but she didn't go into any detail particularly. So I think you have to understand textiles today, and you have to look at how the sculptures are being created. For example, on this one, if I highlight this is a Majapahit period. This is a textile that's heavy and solid, and it stands proud from the body. So it would have been something of a woven fabric. It's not some flimsy textile at all. This is what they were created during the Majapahit period. But they only ever used this Kawung design. There was never anything else in this late Majapahit period.
I think your discussion of the Boro Ganesha is pretty instructive in this regard too, because of your questioning of whether or not indeed it is wearing that block printed fragment of the type that's in the Ashmolean, rather than being a kind of early gold thread woven textile.
Yes, you have to remember that these sculptures are not made for the average person. They've all been commissioned. They don't just appear, and you're having to you're dealing with volcanic stone. If you think of Cambodia, the stone came from far away, so they were always important. Somebody with money had to have commissioned these things. Now you're dealing in Java with volcanic rock, which is difficult to carve, especially the central Javanese ones. It's very solid and it's very rough, and you can't create fine designs. So to create the Bora Ganesha with the amount of detail you had on it, the person's going to have made something important. He's not just going to create a pretty picture. It had to have meant something, and so it would have been for royalty. And so gold means royal. Gold is what you create on this.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect pivot, I think, to another question. But before we fully pivot, people are asking, so yes, we can, or Leslie can at least theorize or hypothesize the kinds of fabrics that might have been used based on observation of these sculptures. One person is very keen to know if you can detect any sign of velvet type textiles.
Velvet, no. No record of velvet. For a start, you have to remember we're in the tropics. Why would you want velvet? Much too hot. That's quite interesting. I'll bring you to a point. There is a lot in the text about the trade of garments that come from China through to Pagan, where it's also hot and humid, of course, as we all know. But once you get to Java, bare-breasted is what's worn, and velvet can only be made in Central Asia with a draw loom, very complex looms that they just never had in Java. No evidence at all, I don't think.
Yeah, so to fully pivot, we have a number of questions. I'll try to categorize them sort of logically in terms of motifs. We're going to go a little over, by the way. It's 1 o'clock, but we're going to go for 5 or 10 more minutes to try to accommodate as many questions as we can. So a lot of questions here about motifs. So we might start with, do you feel that there are different motifs being employed for different fabric types insofar as these sculptures indicate?
No, I don't think so. I think the motifs, if you go back to Central Java, the motifs are simple, unsophisticated. They represented the fabric. Certainly the early ones, the circles and the little flowers, really would only have ever been some type of block printed mordant dyed cotton. There is no evidence of woven fabric at this time. When you come to these interlocking circles, or the Kawung design, and this is very possibly could have been made in a woven fabric. You can weave this pattern, but you could also have drawn it too. So it could also be in a cotton. But when you come to the sophisticated motif on the Manjushri with the many different designs in the circles, that's only some type of sophisticated fabric, and it's much more likely to have been a woven fabric, along with the Parvati with the duck design as well.
Yeah, so, oh, thank you. The motifs are interesting people a lot. So there's a lot of questions here about meaning. A couple of people are wanting to know if you might elaborate a little on the relationship between motifs and possibly the kind of textile, the category of textile or the technique with tantric practice.
Oh yeah, my husband is always wanting me to do more work on the skull designs, and I showed you just one. And in fact, what I haven't done is there are 2 Ganesha, both from Chandigongkong, one in Bangkok Museum and one in Leiden Museum. They both have 2 hip cloths. One is a trouser and an overcloth, and they're all with tantric patterning on them. There is no record anywhere in China of textiles with tantric patterns on. So these can only absolutely have reflected what was going on at the time. And the king, Krutanagara, followed tantric practices. And the Ganesha by this stage are very much tantric Ganesha rather than classic Shaivite Ganesha. From the iconography of them changes completely. So do the patterns reflect the sculpture, or do they reflect what was going on at the time? It's such a difficult one. you know, it's all theory, and the amount of text we have that tells us is so little. So I can only go by what I see, and just by, you know, endless research really, and just trying to understand what was going on at the time.
Do you feel there's evidence for different kinds of textiles that would be more appropriate to a tantric form of expression versus others?
No, not really, because, you know, a Manjushri is part of the Mahayana pantheon, and he's, you know, he comes into this, and there's nothing tantric on him at all, except I would have to say, which I didn't highlight, Manjushri Arapachana holds a sword over his head, and on the hilt of the sword here, the pommel is actually a Vajra, and that's the only one we see. And occasionally in Tibet, you see Manjushri with this Vajra in the pommel. But on the rest of him, there is no tantric iconography at all. So the only ones are really the Ganesha and those two sculptures I showed you with the Chandra Kapala in their hit cloth. So they are also part of this tantric pantheon, because in East Java, you have Hinduism and Buddhism rubbing along side by side. It's not a fusion, it's just a cohesion. They worked together and created this tantric atmosphere that the last king, Krotanagara, was a practitioner of, basically, tantric practices.
Yeah. So to kind of wrap up, could we focus maybe briefly on a couple of specific motifs? We have a question here regarding the diagonally striped Udan Liris light rain motif. Surakarta and Jogjakarta restricted this to anybody but royalty. We have a question then as to whether these patterns represented on the images that you show would not have therefore resembled ordinary people despite trade access, but would rather, due to sumptuary convention and so forth, would likely have been restricted. Is that possible in the time of these statues? Yeah.
The whole Larangang, which is the word for restricted patterns, really only came in that we know about it once the Islamic period started. So by about the 16th century in the Mataram courts, which was the follow-on from the Central Javanese period. Before that, we have no record in anything of restricted patterns. And so the thing like Udan Liris and all of these designs were really brought together as a cohesive group only once Islam really took hold of the courts. But very much in the Mataram courts, even though they might have become Islamic at that stage, the influence from the Hindu-Buddhist period was just underneath the surface. But I think we also have to remember that the Javanese were really Javanese first. They were Javanese before even the Indians arrived, and they remained very Javanese all the way through. So different things happened, but I think the strength of the Javanese tradition, this whole concept of the cosmology through the compass, was very important. So Larangang patterns, I think nothing until Islamic period, really, not before then.
I was also thinking, you didn't have time to talk about it, but for those of you who are interested in this, maybe the 8 statues of the Majapahit period that you describe in depth in your book, that also suggests some interesting angle on this question, right? Because if I recall correctly, please tell me, Leslie, but those 8 images, they're identified as deification images, but we don't have any kind of exclusive utilization of patterns during that period. It's different even than the Singhasari, less diversity.
Yeah, see, when you look at this sculpture here, this is an image of a queen standing with Parvati, with her 2 children beside her. All the Majapahit statues, almost without fail, stand like this with their hands together at the front, with the extra arm, which shows whether they lot of Harihara or they're Shiva or Parvati. But almost 99% of the time, they have this design, as I showed you earlier.
And there isn't a gender distinction either, right?
No gender distinction at all. That a lot of the texts tell us that the king must wear a Xinjiang kawung. So here is the kawung design, and he is wearing a Xinjiang. And this pattern is what the king wears, portrays his power. He's there to protect himself, because I've already explained to you the concept of the compass card importance of this kawung design. But strange enough, in the Majapahit period, the amount of sculptures that are decorated are very, very few. very few. In fact, I probably portrayed all of them in my book, but there are hundreds of Majapahit sculptures. So they only created the ones with textile patterns for the very important Chandi. There were loads and loads of Chandi, and nobody would have had the money to create, or the prestige to create an important sculpture for that. So it's very much power related, I think.
Yeah. And finally, could you comment on the squid motif on Lampung tapas as it relates to stone and bronze sculpture?
Yes, that little Parvati is my favorite piece that it's just created so much issues. The squid motif is really archaic, and there's been a lot about that I think this dates back way longer than the Lampung period. And I think we have to realize that the people of southern Sumatra had been infected by trade for a long, long time. Indian traders would have come through the straits between Java and Sumatra. The trade of gold thread probably came in from India way before we ever knew about it. And that these people created these textiles, and it's they use a silk floss to create this particular type of patterning. And the whole watery squid, because they are a seafaring people. And so how did this little Javanese sculpture found in Java appear with this absolutely Sumatran textile? So maybe he was made in Sumatra and traded to Java, or somebody from Sumatra knew about it and wanted to create this piece. Remember, everything was commissioned. Nothing was made by chance. Everything was made because someone said, I'll pay you 3 sacks of rice if you make this for me. So again, once again, we don't know, but that's the earliest evidence we have of something that looks just like a tapis from Lampung. It's extraordinary. It's just, it's magic.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And for those of you who are asking a number of people in the audience about names of particular motifs, I think I couldn't do any better than to suggest you take a look at Leslie's book, which lays these out and has a very helpful glossary at the end as well.
Yeah.
I think in the interest of time, we should call a halt. And thank you so much, Leslie. It was really a lovely lecture. I really enjoyed it, chock full of information.
My pleasure. I hope everybody gets something from it. I would love to have had 2 hours, but you know, people have to go back to class, I know, or something. So goodbye, everybody, and thanks for being there. I enjoyed it very much. And thank you, Paul, so much.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.